Something extraordinary is happening in Georgia. For weeks, there have been huge protests in the capital, Tbilisi. Their target is something critics call the Russian law.
I feel like this law is going to destroy the European future that my country has been fighting for.
On Wednesday, the Georgian parliament voted through the law. Outside, police and protesters clashed. Inside, there were shouting matches between MPs and fights too. And these demonstrations are about Georgia's future and its past.
They're saying that this is an existential moment for their country. They believe that their government is trying to drag them back to Russia, and they won't accept it.
Georgia shares a long border and a long history with Russia. It was first part of the Russian Empire and then, from the 1920s, part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was born in Georgia. But many years later, in the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Georgia declared independence. Also in the early 90s, there was a civil war in Georgia involving two breakaway regions. In 2008, Russia would send troops in support of them. Their status is still contested. The relationship between Russia and Georgia was and is incredibly sensitive, which brings us back to this new law. It focuses on foreign funding for non-governmental organisations and media. Those that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad must register as bearing the interests of a foreign power. Georgia's government insists this will increase transparency and resist what it calls foreign domination. But the organisations this affects aren't convinced.
It concerns every single non-for-profit organization in the country, including the media outlets. So even the Georgian Red Cross, if they decide not to obey to the regulation of being declared as a foreign spy, even the Georgian Red Cross will be abolished as a result of this law.
And there's a concern this law has echoes of one we've seen elsewhere, in Russia. In 2012, Russia's parliament passed a law that also focused on foreign funding. And according to BBC Monitoring, since its adoption, the law has been used extensively to silence dissenting voices in the media and NGOs. And the US makes a direct comparison between that and what's happening in Georgia.
We're deeply troubled by Georgia's Kremlin-style foreign agents legislation. We have been outspoken about our concerns with the legislation, which runs counter to democratic values.
Georgia's government denies its law is like Russia's, but however the law is seen, we need to look at how Georgia sits between Russia and the West to understand these protests. This picture is from March. It's the Secretary General of the military alliance NATO visiting Georgia. NATO says Georgia will become a member, though there's no detail on when. Georgia also wants to join the European Union and was given candidate status last year, though there's no date for when Georgia may join. And according to one recent poll, 79% of Georgians support EU membership, which again brings us back to this new law, because the EU wants Georgia to withdraw it. Its foreign policy chief says this law negatively impacts Georgia's progress on the EU path. In which case, what's going on here? The country's ceremonial president is one of many who'd like to know.
Who has decided that this law should be reintroduced? Is it in Georgia, or is it beyond our borders? Is it in Moscow that this decision has been taken?
To the main opposition party, well, this is what's happening.
This is really an attempt by the Russian-made billionaire who rules Georgia currently, Bidzina Ivanishvili, to derail Georgia's Euro-Atlantic path.
This is Bidzina Ivanishvili. He's a billionaire who founded and funds the ruling party in Georgia. He made much of his fortune in Russia. And at a recent rally, he made this argument for the new law.
Funding from NGOs, which we are often reproached for and is seen as assistance from abroad, almost entirely goes towards strengthening agent cells and bringing them to power.
Compare that with the Kremlin, which offered support for the law and added, "We see unconcealed meddling into Georgian internal affairs from outside." The messages are very similar, which has led critics to draw parallels between Mr. Ivanishvili and Vladimir Putin. So much so, the protesters show them as one. And as I'm telling you about this new law and the broader issues it raises, you may be thinking of another country, Ukraine. Like Georgia, it's a post-Soviet state. Like Georgia, it has turned towards the EU and NATO. Which is why, as Putin's invasion of Ukraine plays out a few hundred kilometers from Georgia, Georgia's position on the war is being watched closely. Georgia hasn't sanctioned Russia, nor has it backed Ukraine. But despite what the protesters say, the government denies being under Russian influence, and while it defends this law, it knows it's not the end of the story. Not least because there's an election in Georgia later this year. Depending on who wins, the law could be overturned. This debate is going to continue, and as we've been seeing, this law on foreign funding is about much more than that.
For a lot of people that I'm speaking to, this isn't just about the technicalities of a bill that affects NGOs. This is about the entire future of the country, whether it chooses a path of European integration or whether it remains in Moscow's self-declared sphere of influence.
More than 30 years on from the collapse of the Soviet Union, this choice remains, with Moscow and Washington and Brussels all paying close attention to the answer.